The morning frost painted delicate patterns on the windows of Kenton Blake's farmhouse in the outskirts of Trenton, New Jersey. As the sun peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted training grounds, the respected dog breeder stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching his pride and joy, Zara, his faithful German shepherd, making her morning rounds of the property. For over a decade, Zara had been more than just another dog in his prestigious kennel. She was his masterpiece, the living embodiment of everything he had worked to achieve in his breeding program. Her bloodline had produced some of the finest guard dogs in the state, earning Kenton a reputation that brought clients from across the country to his remote property. As he observed her methodical patrol, Kenton couldn't help but notice the slight stiffness in her gait, the way she occasionally paused to rest, the silver streaks that now decorated her once jet-black muzzle. Time had begun to leave its mark on his faithful companion, and with each passing day, the changes became more apparent. Inside the warmth of his office, shelves lined with trophies and certifications testified to years of success in the competitive world of professional dog breeding. Photos chronicled Zara's journey from an eager puppy to the magnificent guardian she had become. One particular image caught his eye: Zara at her prime, standing proudly beside him after winning the regional working dog championships. That day, 3 years ago, had marked the peak of their partnership. The sound of barking from the kennels drew his attention. The younger dogs were awakening, their energy and vitality a stark contrast to Zara's measured movements. Among them were her last litter of puppies, now nearly 2 years old, already showing the same exceptional qualities that had made their mother famous. They represented the future of his breeding program, while Zara, he forced himself to acknowledge, represented its past. Running a successful breeding kennel required more than just passion. It demanded pragmatic business decisions. Each dog needed to contribute to the program's reputation and sustainability. Kenton had built his life's work on producing dogs that exemplified strength, agility, and unwavering loyalty. His clients, military personnel, security companies, and wealthy individuals seeking the finest protection dogs, expected nothing less than perfection. As the morning progressed, Kenton went about his daily routine, conducting training sessions with the younger dogs. He watched as they executed commands with precision, their movements swift and powerful. Yet his gaze kept returning to Zara, who now rested in her favorite spot near the fence, observing the training with what seemed like a mixture of wisdom and weariness. During the afternoon exercise session, what he had been trying to deny became impossible to ignore. While the younger dogs bounded through the agility course with ease, Zara struggled to keep up. She still possessed the heart and discipline that had made her exceptional, but her body couldn't match her spirit anymore. The sight of her laboring through exercises she once dominated sent a wave of emotion through Kenton that he wasn't prepared to handle. That evening, as darkness settled over the property and the winter wind whistled through the trees, Kenton sat in his study, reviewing his kennel's financial records. The numbers were clear and unforgiving. Maintaining aging dogs was expensive, requiring special care, medication, and attention that could be directed toward training and developing younger prospects. But Zara wasn't just another aging dog. She was his partner, his friend, the cornerstone upon which he had built his reputation. As snowflakes began to dance outside his window, Kenton faced the weight of an impossible decision. The business side of his mind told him one thing, while his heart fought against the very thought of it. He picked up her latest veterinary report, his hands slightly trembling as he read through the growing list of age-related concerns. The prognosis was clear. Zara's condition would only continue to decline. In the kennel, Zara lay in her heated bed, her eyes following Kenton's silhouette as he moved past the windows. Despite her aging body, her gaze still held the same intelligence and devotion it had shown since she was a puppy. She couldn't know that her future hung in the balance, that her trusted human companion wrestled with thoughts that would change both their lives forever. The days leading up to Christmas brought no holiday cheer to Kenton Blake's property. Instead, they arrived with bitter winds and heavy grey clouds that seemed to mirror his increasingly troubled thoughts. The festive lights appearing in neighbouring farms only emphasized the darkness that had settled over his heart as he watched Zara struggling more with each passing day. During their morning routines, he began noticing how the cold affected her joints, making her movements increasingly laboured. The veterinary bills piled up on his desk like the snow outside. Medications for arthritis, special supplements, heated bedding. All necessary expenses for a dog that could no longer contribute to his breeding program. The practical part of his mind kept returning to this harsh reality, while his conscience waged war against his business sense. One particularly frosty morning, as Kenton conducted training sessions with his younger dogs, an incident occurred that shattered his remaining illusions. Zara, attempting to participate in the routine she had performed thousands of times before, stumbled during a simple obstacle course. The younger dog surged past her while she struggled to regain her footing in the snow. The sight struck Kenton like a physical blow. This was no longer just about business, it was about dignity. That evening, a potential client visited the kennel, interested in purchasing a protection dog. As Kenton showcased his younger animal's capabilities, the client noticed Zara resting in her heated corner. "That's her, isn't it?" the man asked, recognition in his voice. "The famous Zara. I remember seeing her compete 3 years ago. She was magnificent." The words, though meant as a compliment, felt like accusations to Kenton. The contrast between what Zara had been and what she had become stood stark in his mind. Later that night, unable to sleep, Kenton found himself reviewing old training videos. On the screen, a younger Zara moved with grace and power, executing complex commands with precision that had set the standard for his entire breeding program. The videos spanned years. Puppies she had produced, championships she had won, demonstrations that had secured his reputation. Each image seemed to demand an answer to the question he had been avoiding. What did he owe this loyal companion who had given him everything? The forecast predicted heavy snow for the coming week. Kenton spent hours in his office, making phone calls to various retirement facilities for working dogs. Each conversation ended the same way: astronomical costs, long waiting lists, and no guarantees about quality of care. The financial reality of his situation became increasingly clear. Maintaining Zara was slowly draining resources needed to keep his breeding program competitive. In moments of clarity, Kenton recognized that his struggle wasn't purely financial. It was about watching a proud, capable being gradually lose her ability to be what she had always been, a working dog of the highest caliber. Every morning, despite her limitations, Zara still attempted to perform her duties, her desire to serve unchanged, even as her body failed her. This devotion only made his dilemma more painful. The weekend before Christmas, during a solitary walk through his property, Kenton discovered Zara had followed him despite the cold. She moved slowly through the snow, her breath visible in the winter air, but her eyes remained fixed on him with unwavering loyalty. The sight caused something to break inside him. He knew he had to make a decision, one that would haunt him either way. That evening, as darkness fell early and the first flakes of new snow began to fall, Kenton sat in his study with Zara's medical records spread before him. The prognosis was clear. Her condition would continue to deteriorate. The costs would continue to rise. His business, already feeling the pressure of maintaining an aging dog, would suffer more with each passing month. As midnight approached, Kenton made his decision. He carefully packed a bag with some basic supplies and Zara's favorite blanket. Tomorrow, he decided, would be the day. He would take her to the state park near the dense forest that bordered the city limits. The thought of what he planned made him physically ill, but he had convinced himself it was the only solution to an impossible situation. That night, as Zara slept peacefully in her heated bed, unaware of what the next day would bring, Kenton remained awake, tormented by thoughts of tomorrow. The wind howled outside his window, and somewhere in the distance he heard the sound of winter birds calling through the darkness, a sound that seemed to carry both warning and judgment. The morning arrived shrouded in dense fog, with heavy clouds hanging low over Trenton like a grey curtain. Kenton hadn't slept, his mind replaying memories of Zara's decade of faithful service. As he prepared for what he had convinced himself was necessary, each movement felt mechanical, disconnected from his racing thoughts. Zara sensed something different in her master's demeanor that morning. When Kenton approached her with the leash, she tilted her head slightly, studying his face with those intelligent brown eyes that had always seemed to understand more than a dog should. Despite her stiff joints, she rose eagerly. A car ride was still a car ride after all, and her loyalty remained undiminished by age. The drive to the state park was silent, except for Zara's gentle breathing from the back seat. Kenton avoided looking in the rearview mirror, knowing that meeting her trusting gaze might shatter his resolve. The radio remained off. He couldn't bear the cheerful holiday music that filled every station. The winter landscape passed by in a blur of whites and greys, matching the turmoil in his heart. As they pulled into the deserted parking lot, the fog had begun to lift, revealing a forest draped in fresh snow. Kenton helped Zara out of the car, noting how she still waited patiently for his command before jumping down, ever the trained professional. The path they took led away from the marked trails, deeper into the quiet woods where the snow lay undisturbed, except for occasional deer tracks. Their walk was slower than usual, with Kenton matching his pace to Zara's careful steps through the snow. She stopped occasionally to investigate interesting scents, her nose working overtime to process the unfamiliar environment. Despite her age, her training showed in how she regularly checked back with Kenton, making sure she remained within his sight. After about an hour of walking, they reached a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. The spot seemed peaceful, protected from the harsh wind by the surrounding forest. Kenton's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket for the new leather collar he had brought, one without any identifying tags. His fingers fumbled with the buckles as he replaced her old collar, each second feeling like an eternity. Zara stood patiently through the collar change, occasionally licking Kenton's cold hands, perhaps sensing his distress. Her trust in him remained absolute, even as he secured her leash to a sturdy low branch. He had chosen this spot carefully, sheltered, but close enough to human trails that someone might pass by eventually. The moment of departure arrived too quickly, and yet not quickly enough. Kenton knelt beside Zara one last time, his hands running through her thick fur, memorizing the feel of it. She leaned into his touch, as she had done thousands of times before, her tail wagging slightly, despite her confusion about being tethered to the tree. "Stay!" he commanded, his voice barely a whisper. It was the last command he would ever give her, and like always, she obeyed without question. As he stood and turned away, Zara remained exactly where she was. The perfect picture of obedience she had always been. She didn't whine or bark. Her training ran too deep for that. She simply watched, waiting for her master's return, complete faith evident in her steady gaze. Walking away was the hardest thing Kenton had ever done. Each step felt like walking through deep mud, his legs heavy with the weight of his choice. He forced himself not to look back, knowing that if he did, his resolve would crumble entirely. The sound of his footsteps crunching through the snow seemed unnaturally loud in the winter silence. Behind him, Zara maintained her position, still believing this was just another training exercise. She had spent her entire life trusting Kenton's commands, and even now, she would wait patiently for his return. The reality of abandonment hadn't yet registered in her loyal heart. As Kenton reached his car, the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall. The woods had grown darker, and the wind carried the promise of a heavy snowfall to come. He sat behind the steering wheel for several long minutes, his hands gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. The empty back seat reflected in his rearview mirror seemed to mock him with its emptiness. The drive home was a blur, his mind still back in the clearing with Zara. The holiday decorations along the streets of Trenton seemed garish now, their cheerful lights at odds with the darkness he felt inside. As he pulled into his driveway, the familiar sound of his other dogs barking their welcome felt hollow, incomplete without Zara's distinctive voice among them. That night, as the promised snowstorm raged outside his window, Kenton sat in his darkened office, surrounded by the memories of a lifetime spent building his reputation on the foundation of trust between handler and dog. The irony of how he had betrayed that very trust was not lost on him, and somewhere in the howling wind, he imagined he could hear the echo of a loyal heart breaking. The first hours after Kenton's departure, Zara remained steadfast at her post, her training keeping her rooted to the spot despite the growing discomfort of cold seeping through her pores. As daylight began to fade and the snowfall intensified, a new understanding slowly dawned in her eyes. This wasn't a training exercise. The familiar sound of Kenton's footsteps wouldn't be returning through the deepening snow. The leather collar, though new, was still attached to the leash that held her to the tree. As temperatures dropped and hunger began to gnaw at her stomach, instincts long suppressed by years of domestication started to surface. The proud guard dog, who had never before challenged her restraints, began to examine her tether with newfound purpose. At first, her attempts to free herself were hesitant. Years of training had taught her that pulling against a leash was forbidden. But as the winter night descended and the cold became more intense, survival instincts overcame ingrained obedience. With careful, deliberate movements, she began working at the leather with her teeth, her powerful jaws making steady progress against the material. Hours passed, marked only by the steadily falling snow and the increasing urgency of her efforts. Finally, with one last powerful twist, the weathered leather gave way. Zara found herself free, but freedom brought its own challenges. The familiar world of commands, routines, and guaranteed meals was gone, replaced by the wild uncertainty of the forest at night. For several moments, she stood motionless, her senses overwhelmed by the symphony of the wild. The wind carried countless unfamiliar scents. The darkness held unknown movements, and the very ground beneath her paws felt foreign. The comfortable life at Kenton's kennel seemed like a distant dream now, replaced by the immediate needs of survival. Her first steps away from the tree were tentative, each paw placement carefully considered. Despite her age, Zara's training as a working dog had kept her physically capable, if not as strong as in her prime. She moved with purpose, her nose working overtime to process the complex tapestry of forest scents, pine needles, small animals, decaying leaves beneath the snow. The storm intensified as she navigated through the darkness, using her keen sense of smell and hearing to avoid obstacles. Her thick coat, though not designed for prolonged exposure to such conditions, provided some protection against the elements. Each step took her further from the clearing, deeper into the forest where the trees grew closer together, offering some shelter from the driving snow. As dawn approached, Zara found herself facing her first real test of survival. A hollow beneath a fallen log provided temporary shelter, and she huddled there, conserving energy and processing her new reality. The sounds of the forest awakening around her were both threatening and intriguing to her trained ears. Small animals moved through the underbrush, and birds began their morning calls. Hunger eventually drove her from her shelter. Years of structured feeding had not prepared her for the challenge of finding her own food, but deeper instincts began to emerge. She noticed subtle movements in the snow, small rodents moving beneath the surface. Her first attempts at hunting were clumsy, her movements too direct, too influenced by years of controlled training. But with each failure, she learned, adapted, and grew more attuned to her natural abilities. By midday, exhaustion and hunger had taken their toll, but Zara's spirit remained unbroken. Her methodical patrol patterns, ingrained through years of training, now served a new purpose as she systematically explored her surroundings. Each new area was approached with caution, each potential food source evaluated with growing wisdom. The afternoon brought an unexpected discovery. Near a stream partially frozen over, Zara found tracks of other animals coming to drink. The water, though bitingly cold, provided her first drink since being left behind. As she lapped at the crystal-clear liquid, her reflection caught her eye. A proud German shepherd, still carrying herself with dignity despite her circumstances. As the second night approached, Zara had begun to establish a routine of sorts. She found a more permanent shelter, a deep recess beneath a cluster of fallen trees, positioned to block the worst of the wind. Her guard dog training proved unexpectedly valuable as she secured her position, instinctively choosing a spot with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. In the growing darkness, the forest came alive with new sounds and movements. Owls called in the distance, and unseen creatures rustled through the underbrush. Yet Zara remained calm, her years of training helping her distinguish between genuine threats and normal forest activity. She settled into her shelter, alert but resting, conserving energy for the challenges ahead. That night, as the storm finally began to ease, Zara's eyes reflected the starlight that occasionally broke through the clouds. She was no longer just a trained guard dog. She was becoming something more, something her ancestors had been long ago. The comfortable life at the kennel was behind her, but her indomitable spirit remained undiminished, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in this new chapter of her life. A week into her new life in the forest, Zara had established a delicate rhythm of survival. Her movements through the snow-covered landscape had become more assured, her hunting skills sharper with each passing day. The wilderness, initially so alien to her trained sensibilities, was slowly becoming familiar territory. Yet something was missing, a purpose beyond mere survival that had always defined her existence as a working dog. That purpose would find her on a bitter, cold morning as she tracked the scent of potential prey through a maze of snow-laden pines. The wind carried an unusual combination of smells, the metallic tang of blood, the musky scent of wolf, and something else, something that stirred long-dormant instincts in her heart. The sound reached her sensitive ears before she saw them. Tiny whimpers, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the trees. Following the sounds led her to a small clearing. There, in a shallow depression beneath a fallen log, lay a sight that stopped her in her tracks. 4 wolf pups, no more than a few weeks old, huddled together for warmth. Their mother, a magnificent silver-grey wolf, lay motionless nearby, her final act having been to shelter her babies from the brutal winter storm. Zara approached cautiously, her training warring with instinct. The pups were weak from hunger and cold, their tiny bodies trembling as they sought warmth that was no longer there. As she drew closer, they showed no fear. Too young to know that this large domestic dog should be a stranger to them. Instead, they responded to her presence with desperate hope, crawling toward her with what little strength they had left. Something profound shifted in Zara's heart at that moment. All her years of training, all her careful discipline gave way to something more primitive and powerful, a maternal instinct that transcended species. Without hesitation, she lowered herself beside the pups, allowing them to huddle against her warm body. They burrowed into her thick fur immediately, their small bodies gradually stopping their trembling as they absorbed her warmth. The next few hours were a flurry of activity as Zara's protective instincts took over. She carefully moved each pup, one by one, to a more sheltered location she had discovered during her days in the forest, a small cave formed by fallen rocks, protected from wind and weather. The move was painstaking, requiring multiple trips as she gently carried each precious bundle by the scruff of its neck, just as she would have done with her own puppies. In her new role as surrogate mother, Zara's experienced nose quickly located a nest of field mice nearby. Her hunting skills, though still developing, proved sufficient to catch several of the small rodents. She chewed the meat into manageable pieces for the pups, an act that came naturally despite never having raised a litter of her own. The pups accepted her offering eagerly, their trust in her growing with each passing moment. As evening approached, Zara settled into her new den with the pups snuggled against her belly. Their tiny bodies were warm now, their bellies as full as she could make them with her limited hunting skills. She remained alert, her trained guard dog instincts now focused on protecting these vulnerable lives that fate had entrusted to her care. The pups, too young to understand the unusual nature of their adoption, accepted Zara completely. They nuzzled against her with the same trust they would have shown their birth mother, their tiny paws kneading her fur as they drifted off to sleep. For the first time since being left in the forest, Zara felt truly at peace. She had found what every working dog needs, a mission, a purpose, something to protect. That night, as the winter wind howled outside their sheltered den, Zara kept vigil over her adopted family. Each tiny snore, each twitch of dreaming pups reinforced her newfound purpose. She was no longer just surviving, she was living for something greater than herself. The training that had made her an exceptional guard dog now had a new focus, protecting and nurturing these wild creatures who needed her. In the darkness, Zara's eyes reflected a new determination. The comfortable life at the kennel, the daily routines, even the pain of abandonment, all seemed to fade in importance compared to the responsibility she had now assumed. These pups needed more than just protection. They would need guidance, training, and preparation for life in the wild. It was a challenge unlike any she had faced before, but one that called to the very core of her being. As the moon rose over the snow-covered forest, casting silver light through the trees, Zara tugged one of the pups closer with her paw, adjusting its position for better warmth. In this simple act of maternal care, she found a new identity, no longer just a retired guard dog, but a protector and teacher to these wild children of the forest. The night settled around them, peaceful and quiet, as Zara began her first night as mother to a most unusual family. As weeks passed, Zara's small den became a unique training ground, where the disciplines of a guard dog merged with the raw instincts of the wild. The 4 wolf pups, whom she had come to recognize by their distinct personalities, were growing stronger each day under her careful guidance. Her years of training at Kenton's kennel now served an unexpected purpose as she adapted those lessons for survival in the forest. The largest pup, a bold male with a white patch on his chest, reminded her of the confident shepherds she used to train with. She named him Scout in her mind, recognizing his natural tendency to lead the others. The smallest, a female with unusual golden eyes, became Grace for her fluid movements. The other 2, both males with similar silver-gray coats, she thought of as Shadow and Storm, their personalities as distinct as their subtle markings. Each morning began with what Zara's instincts told her was essential training. Just as she had once patrolled the kennel's perimeter, she now led her adopted family in careful circuits around their territory. She taught them to move silently through the snow, showing them how to place their paws to avoid making noise, a skill she had learned from years of security training that proved equally valuable in the wild. The pups learned quickly, their wild instincts enhanced by Zara's methodical teaching style. She showed them how to use their noses effectively, a skill refined through her years of training. When Scout would become too eager, rushing ahead without properly assessing his surroundings, Zara would gently correct him with a soft growl, the same tone she had used with young dogs in training at the kennel. Hunting lessons became a fascinating blend of domestic training and wild instinct. Zara had developed her own hunting skills over the past weeks, but she approached teaching them with the same patience and structure she had learned as a working dog. She demonstrated the art of staying downwind, of reading the subtle movements in the snow that indicated prey beneath, of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Grace proved to be the most adept hunter, her natural stealth complemented by Zara's teachings. The little wolf pup could creep through the snow with remarkable precision, often succeeding in catching mice where her brothers failed. Zara would reward successful hunts with approving nuzzles, just as she had once been rewarded with praise during her training days. The afternoons were often spent in what Zara instinctively knew was crucial practice, the art of staying hidden. She taught the pups to use the terrain for concealment, showing them how to press their bodies low in the snow and remain still, skills she had learned for guard work, but that served equally well for survival. Shadow and Storm particularly excelled at this, their natural coloring blending perfectly with the winter landscape. As dusk approached each day, Zara would lead her family in what she considered essential emergency response training. She had specific barks, short, sharp sounds she had learned as a guard dog, that she adapted to warn the pups of different dangers. The pups learned quickly that one bark meant to freeze in place, while two meant to return to the den immediately. These commands, born from her training days, became vital tools for keeping her wild family safe. In quiet moments, as the pups rested in their den, Zara would stand guard at the entrance, her posture as proud and alert as it had been during her days at the kennel. She would watch them sleep, their little bodies twitching as they dreamed, and feel a sense of purpose stronger than anything she had known before. The discipline of her training life merged seamlessly with her new role as protector and teacher. The pups grew remarkably under her care, their wild nature enhanced rather than diminished by the structured guidance she provided. They learned to work as a team, just as Zara had once worked with other dogs in Kenton's training programs. When they hunted together, each pup naturally fell into a role, Scout leading, Grace flanking, Shadow and Storm bringing up the rear, a formation that reminded Zara of the coordinated exercises she used to perform. On particularly cold evening, as the family settled into their den, Zara watched with pride as her pupils demonstrated how well they had learned their lessons. Grace had spotted a potential threat, a fox prowling too close to their territory, and had signaled the others with a soft whine Zara had taught her. The pups had responded perfectly, silently retreating to the den while maintaining visual contact with each other, just as Zara had trained them. As the moon rose over their snowy domain, Zara settled in with her unusual family, feeling a deep satisfaction. The pups snuggled against her, their wild hearts beating in rhythm with her domesticated one, creating a harmony that transcended the boundaries between their worlds. In teaching them, she had found a perfect balance between the disciplined guard dog she had been trained to be and the wild mother she had become. That night, as the wind sang through the trees outside their den, Zara watched over her sleeping charges with the same dedication she had once shown guarding Kenton's property. But now, her purpose was greater, her mission more profound. She was not just protecting property or following commands. She was preparing these wild souls for survival while giving them the benefits of her years of training and experience. The kennel felt empty despite being full of dogs. 2 weeks had passed since Kenton had left Zara in the forest, and every corner of his property seemed to echo with her absence. The younger dogs still performed their routines perfectly. The business continued to operate smoothly, but something fundamental had changed, not in his surroundings, but in himself. The first few days after leaving Zara, Kenton had thrown himself into his work with almost manic intensity, as if keeping busy could drown out the voice of his conscience. He trained dogs from dawn until dusk, exhausting himself physically to avoid the thoughts that plagued him at night. But Zara's presence, or rather her absence, haunted every aspect of his daily routine. During training sessions, he would catch himself turning to share a triumphant moment with her, only to be struck anew by the reality of what he had done. The spot where she used to watch the training sessions remained conspicuously empty, and even the other dogs seemed to sense the wrongness of her absence. They would occasionally glance at her former post, as if expecting her to materialize and restore the natural order of their world. The breaking point came during a routine visit from one of his long-time clients. The woman, who had known Zara for years, asked about her with genuine concern. "How's the old girl doing? She must be enjoying her retirement." The innocent question shattered Kenton's carefully maintained facade. He mumbled something about Zara being relocated to a special facility, but the lie tasted like ashes in his mouth. That night, unable to sleep, Kenton found himself reviewing years of training videos. On the screen, a younger Zara moved with fluid grace, her eyes always focused on him, trusting him completely. Each frame seemed to accuse him, highlighting the depth of betrayal he had committed against his most faithful companion. The practical reasons that had seemed so compelling 2 weeks ago now felt hollow and shameful. Dawn found him in his truck, driving toward the state park. The rational part of his mind told him it was futile. Even if Zara had survived, she would have moved far from where he had left her, but he had to try. He owed her that much, and more. The morning was cold and clear, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Parking in the now familiar lot, Kenton grabbed his backpack filled with supplies, food, first aid supplies, warm blankets. Following the path they had taken that day, every step felt like a weight on his conscience. The forest was quiet except for the crunch of his boots in the snow and the occasional call of winter birds. Reaching the clearing where he had left her, Kenton found it transformed by recent snowfall, but there, partially buried in the white powder, was the remnant of the leather collar. He knelt beside it, fingers trembling as he brushed away the snow. The leather had been cleanly chewed through. Zara had freed herself. The discovery filled him with both hope and deeper remorse. Over the next several hours, Kenton methodically searched the surrounding area, looking for any sign of her passage. His years of experience training tracking dogs now served to help him read the forest floor, despite the recent snowfall. He found occasional marks that might have been her tracks, leading deeper into the forest. But the trail was old and fragmented. As daylight began to fade, Kenton was forced to return to his truck, but something had changed within him. The crushing weight of guilt had been transformed into a determination to make things right. He would return, day after day if necessary, until he found her. His business, which had seemed so important just weeks ago, now felt secondary to this mission of redemption. That evening, instead of returning home, Kenton drove to the local outdoor supply store. He purchased proper winter hiking gear, detailed maps of the forest area, and supplies for extended searches. The elderly clerk, noting his intense focus, asked if he was planning an expedition. "I'm looking for someone," Kenton replied simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Someone I never should have lost." Back at the kennel, Kenton began transforming his office into a search headquarters. He pinned maps to the walls, marking areas he had already searched and planning systematic sweeps of the forest. His expertise in training search and rescue dogs now served a deeply personal mission. He knew the odds were against him. The forest was vast, and weeks had passed. But he had taught Zara never to give up, and now he would live by that same principle. Late that night, as a light snow fell outside his window, Kenton sat at his desk writing in a journal he had started to track his search efforts. The entry was simple but determined. "I will find you, old friend, and when I do, I'll spend the rest of my days making this right." The words were a promise, not just to Zara, but to himself, a commitment to rectifying the greatest mistake of his life. The forest had changed. Zara sensed it first in the subtle shift of scents on the wind, in the nervous energy of the small creatures that usually scurried about their territory. Her trained instincts, sharpened by weeks in the wild, detected what her adopted pups were still too young to notice. They were no longer alone in this part of the forest. The signs were unmistakable. Fresh paw prints in the snow, larger than her own, appeared with increasing frequency around the periphery of their territory. The howls that echoed through the night were growing closer, carrying messages she couldn't fully understand, but recognized as declarations of presence and intent. A rival wolf pack was moving into their area, drawn by the promise of prey in their well-maintained hunting grounds. Scout, the boldest of her pups, was the first to notice his mother's changed behavior. Where once they had ranged freely during their training sessions, Zara now kept them closer to their den. Their exercises focused more on stealth and concealment than hunting. She had intensified their practice of silent communication, the subtle ear movements and tail positions that could convey messages without sound. One crisp morning, as Zara led the pups through their daily patrol, she froze mid-step. Grace, always the most attuned to her adoptive mother's signals, immediately dropped into the snow-hiding position she had been taught. Her brothers followed suit, their bodies becoming nearly invisible against the white backdrop. 20 yards ahead, a massive black wolf stood watching them, his presence both a challenge and an assessment. Zara's guard dog training kicked in instinctively. She positioned herself between the wolf and her pups, her posture communicating both confidence and warning. The standoff lasted only moments before the black wolf melted back into the forest, but the message was clear. Their presence had been noted, and this was only the beginning. Meanwhile, deeper in the forest, Kenton's systematic search was beginning to yield results. 3 weeks into his daily expeditions, he had started to notice patterns in the wildlife movements that reminded him of organized patrol routes, something only a trained dog would implement. His years of experience told him these weren't random animal tracks. They showed the methodical thoroughness that had been Zara's trademark. That same morning, as Zara faced the black wolf, Kenton discovered something that made his heart race. In a small clearing, he found tracks that told a story his trained eye could read perfectly. Large canine prints accompanied by smaller ones, moving in formation patterns eerily similar to the training exercises he had taught for years. But there was something odd about the smaller tracks. They weren't dog prints. Back at their den, Zara implemented new security measures drawn from her years of training. She taught the pups to use different entrances and exits, never following the same path twice. Shadow and Storm, naturally cautious, took to these lessons eagerly, while Scout needed frequent reminders to check his enthusiasm. Grace, ever observant, seemed to understand the gravity of their situation and helped keep her brothers in line. The pack's presence grew more assertive with each passing day. Their howls grew bolder, closer, carrying clear messages of territorial claim. Zara recognized the strategy from her security training. They were testing boundaries, looking for weaknesses. She responded by adjusting her family's routines, never letting them stay in one place too long, always keeping multiple escape routes open. Kenton, too, sensed he was getting closer. The signs were becoming fresher, more frequent. He had begun to hear distant howls during his searches, something unusual for this part of the forest. His tracking skills, honed by years of working with dogs, told him he was on the right path. But the howls also worried him. They spoke of wild dangers he had never intended Zara to face. One afternoon, as weak winter sunlight filtered through the trees, both Zara's and Kenton's worlds moved closer to collision. She had led her family to a new hunting ground, forced to abandon their usual territory by the increasing presence of the wolf pack. The pups, despite their training, were showing signs of stress from the constant movement and tension. Just as Zara was teaching them to hunt in this new area, a familiar scent caught her attention. Human, but not just any human. Her keen nose picked up traces of the kennel, of home, of Kenton. For a moment she stood frozen, years of training warring with her new wild instincts and maternal responsibilities. Kenton, less than a mile away, was examining fresh tracks in the snow when he heard it, a distant bark that he would have recognized anywhere. It was Zara's warning bark, the same one she had used thousands of times at the kennel to alert him to potential threats. But there was something different in it now, something protective rather than merely alerting. As the day drew to a close, both Zara and Kenton sensed that everything was about to change. The wolf pack's howls were getting closer, more numerous. Speaking of imminent action, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. In her den, Zara gathered her pups close, her body tense with anticipation. Miles away, Kenton made camp for the first time instead of returning home, knowing in his heart that he was finally close to finding her. The night settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, but no one rested easily. The wild was preparing for a clash of worlds, domestic and savage, past and present, loyalty and survival. And somewhere in the darkness, a pack of wolves moved steadily closer to the den where a former guard dog protected her adopted wild family with all the skills her former master had taught her. The storm arrived at dawn, turning the forest into a swirling canvas of white. Zara had spent the night moving her family between temporary shelters, staying one step ahead of the encroaching wolf pack. The pups, despite their exhaustion, followed her commands perfectly, putting every lesson she had taught them into practice. Grace led her brothers in formation through the snow, their movements silent and coordinated, just as Zara had trained them. The black wolf's pack had grown bold, no longer bothering to conceal their presence. Their tracks crisscrossed the territory in ever-tightening circles. Like a noose slowly closing, Zara recognized the tactical advantage they held. They were many, she was one, and her pups, though well-trained, were still too young for confrontation. Meanwhile, Kenton had awakened to the sound of howls carrying through the storm. His years of experience with working dogs told him something significant was unfolding in these woods. Following his instincts and training, he moved carefully through the whiteness, reading the signs of disturbance in the snow, multiple sets of tracks converging toward a common point. The confrontation began near a frozen stream, where steep banks created a natural corridor through the forest. Zara had been leading her family toward higher ground when she sensed the trap closing. The black wolf appeared ahead of them, while his pack members emerged from the swirling snow on both sides. Their coordinated movement spoke of experienced hunters who had done this before. Scout, ever protective, moved to stand beside his adoptive mother, while Grace quickly herded Shadow and Storm into a defensive position they had practiced countless times. Zara's training had prepared them well. They moved as one unit, backs together, facing outward just as she had taught them. The discipline of a guard dog merged perfectly with their wild instincts. The black wolf advanced first, his massive form cutting through the falling snow. Zara recognized the authority in his stance. This was about territory, about pack dominance, about the natural order of things. But she had spent a lifetime learning a different kind of order, one based on protection and unwavering loyalty rather than mere survival. Just as the tension reached its peak, a sound cut through the storm. A sharp, clear whistle that Zara hadn't heard in months. It was Kenton's command whistle, the one he had used thousands of times in training. The sound froze everyone in place, wolves, pups, and Zara herself, creating a tableau in the swirling snow. Kenton emerged from the whiteness like a ghost, his familiar form somehow both strange and comforting to Zara's eyes. He moved with the careful confidence of someone who understood wild things, keeping his distance while assessing the situation. His years of experience with animals told him exactly what he was witnessing, a standoff between territories, between wild and tame, between past and present. The black wolf turned to face this new development, his pack momentarily distracted by the human presence. It was all the opening Zara needed. With a series of short, sharp barks, the same ones she had used to direct younger dogs in training, she orchestrated her family's movement. Grace led her brothers in a swift, practiced maneuver toward a hidden path they had scouted earlier, while Zara held her ground. Kenton recognized the training patterns in their movement. This was his Zara, still the brilliant guardian and teacher he had always known, but now using her skills to protect a different kind of family. Without hesitation, he began moving parallel to Zara's position, creating a second point of pressure that forced the wolf pack to split their attention. The black wolf found himself in an unexpected tactical dilemma. The discipline and coordination of Zara and her unusual family disrupted the normal patterns of wild confrontation. The pups moved with a precision that confused his pack, while the human's presence added an unpredictable element to the equation. Snow continued to fall as the standoff reached its crucial moment. Zara stood her ground, her posture reflecting years of professional training, combined with newfound wild strength. The black wolf, intelligent enough to recognize an untenable situation, took a step back. His pack, reading his signal, began to withdraw into the swirling whiteness. As the wolves melted away into the storm, Zara maintained her guard position, her training too ingrained to let her relax until she was certain the threat had passed. Kenton remained still, watching with a mixture of pride and amazement as his former student demonstrated mastery of everything he had ever taught her, but in ways he had never imagined. The pups, following their training perfectly, had regrouped in a sheltered position nearby. They watched with keen interest as their mother faced this human from her past. The moment of truth had arrived. Would Zara choose her new wild family or return to her domestic life? Kenton knelt in the snow, removing his glove despite the cold. He held out his hand, palm up, not as a master commanding his dog's return, but as a friend asking for forgiveness. The gesture hung in the air between them, weighted with months of separation and regret. Zara looked at his offered hand, then back at her pups, then at Kenton again. In that moment, she was both the trained guard dog and the wild mother, both the faithful companion and the fierce protector. The choice before her wasn't really a choice at all. It was an opportunity to bridge two worlds. As the snow continued to fall in the hushed forest, Zara made a decision that would transform both her world and Kenton's. With deliberate steps, she approached her former master, but not as a returning pet. Her bearing was that of an equal, a fellow protector who had found her own path. When she finally reached his outstretched hand, she pressed her nose against it briefly before turning back to look at her pups. Kenton understood. In that moment of connection, he saw everything. The depth of his mistake in abandoning her, the wonder of how she had not just survived, but thrived, and most importantly, the new purpose she had found. The proud German shepherd before him was no longer just his former student. She was a teacher, a protector, a bridge between the wild and domestic worlds. The pups watched from their position, maintaining perfect formation just as Zara had taught them. Grace, ever the perceiver, was the first to understand that this human posed no threat. She edged forward slightly, her movements showing the influence of both her wild heritage and Zara's training. Scout, Shadow, and Storm followed her lead, their behavior reflecting months of careful instruction. As Kenton observed the pups' disciplined approach, his trainer's eye recognized something remarkable. Zara hadn't just survived in the wild, she had created something unprecedented. These wolf pups moved with the precision of working dogs while maintaining their wild essence. They were neither fully wild nor domestic, but something new and extraordinary. Over the next few hours, as the storm began to ease, Kenton witnessed the full extent of what Zara had accomplished. She demonstrated how she had adapted his training techniques to teach the pups survival skills, combining the best of both worlds. The pups showed off their abilities, stalking silently through snow, responding to silent signals, working as a coordinated team. A plan began to form in Kenton's mind, his property backed up against these same woods, with acres of undeveloped land between his kennel and the forest proper. What if, instead of trying to force Zara to choose between her two lives, he could help her bridge them? The isolation that had once served his breeding program could now protect something far more precious, a new kind of family. As the day progressed, Kenton joined Zara and the pups on their patrol route. He watched in amazement as she led them through their daily training exercises, noting how she had modified his techniques to serve their unique needs. The pups, initially wary, began to accept his presence, particularly when they saw how naturally Zara integrated him into their routine. That evening, Kenton made his proposal. He would create a protected corridor between the forest and his property, a safe zone where Zara's unusual family could thrive. The pups could grow up with the freedom of the wild while benefiting from the security and supplemental care he could provide. Most importantly, Zara wouldn't have to choose between her past and present. She could be both the trained guardian and the wild mother she had become. Over the following weeks, Kenton transformed his property. He established feeding stations at strategic points along the forest border, created sheltered rest areas, and modified his security systems to protect rather than confine. His years of experience with working dogs found new purpose as he helped Zara continue the unique education of her adopted family. The pups grew stronger and more capable under their mother's continued guidance, now enhanced by Kenton's support. They learned to navigate both worlds, wild enough to maintain their independence, yet comfortable enough with human presence to accept help when needed. Grace's natural intelligence blossomed as she learned to serve as a bridge between her siblings and Kenton. Scout's protective instincts were refined by exposure to proper training techniques, while Shadow and Storm developed into perfect scouts, masters of moving unseen between forest and farmland. Zara herself seemed to grow younger, energized by her role as ambassador between worlds. She spent her days patrolling the borders of their expanded territory, dividing her time between the forest and the kennel. The other dogs on Kenton's property accepted her unusual family, creating an unprecedented community where domestic and wild creatures coexisted in harmony. As spring approached, bringing new life to the forest, Kenton sat on his porch watching Zara lead her family through their evening exercises. The pups, nearly grown now, moved with a grace that reflected both their wild heritage and their careful training. In their fluid movements, he saw the future, not just of his kennel, but of a new understanding between the domestic and the wild. Zara had taught him more than he had ever taught her. Through her, he learned that true loyalty transcends boundaries, that wisdom can wear many forms, and that sometimes the best path forward is one that bridges different worlds rather than choosing between them. His kennel evolved into something more than a training facility. It became a sanctuary where the line between wild and tame blurred, and where second chances were always possible. As the sun set over the property, Zara sat between her two worlds, the forest on one side, the kennel on the other. She was no longer just a retired guard dog, nor simply a wild mother. She had become something more, a pioneer, a teacher, a symbol of the extraordinary things that can happen when trust, loyalty, and love are given the freedom to find their own path. If this story touched your heart, remember that there are countless tales of redemption, second chances, and unexpected families waiting to be discovered. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring narratives that explore the beautiful connections between humans and animals. Leave a like if you believe in the power of forgiveness and new beginnings, and share your own stories of extraordinary bonds in the comments below. Together, let's celebrate the remarkable ways that love can bridge any divide and heal any heart.